Hi, and welcome to Ones and Twos, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining us, as always, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, Adam Tooze, this week with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, in the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about the Winter Olympics, albeit from a oblique angle. We're going to be talking about the region in which the upcoming Olympics is taking place, namely Milan and the surrounding region of Lombardy. So stick around for that. But first, a data point, and that is 256 billion, as in $256 billion, which is the amount of money that Beijing says it is pouring into the People's Liberation Army in 2025. That reflects China's status as the world's second largest military spender. It also underscores the Chinese government's drive to modernize its armed forces. But that policy is generally being put into stark relief by the convulsions of the Army's senior command in the past several years. Those are convulsions initiated, by all accounts, by President Xi Jinping. It's fair to say Xi has been conducting a purge of the PLA's top ranks, with dozens of generals and defense industry leaders investigated, sidelined in recent years. And that's all culminated this past week in the removal of Xi's longtime number 2 general, Zhang Youxia. And the reports are he's being investigated for serious violations of discipline and law. That's the quotation. State media suggests that disloyalty or bribery could be behind his purge. International media has had reporting about maybe even the leaking of sensitive military, even nuclear secrets. But yeah, all this comes in the context of these earlier purges that I mentioned. And the stakes are very high because, as I mentioned, the sums on the line are themselves vast, and China's goals militarily are vast. It has pretty ambitious military targets that we can get into. And yeah, to start off with, Adam, in understanding what just happened this past week, should we be taking these allegations and rumors of Zhang's corruption and treason at face value? I mean, it seems like that would be a bit naive given the broader kind of purges taking place. And if not, I mean, what is the kind of substance of his split with Xi exactly?
Well, I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating area that everyone in the world has suddenly tried to turn themselves into a PLA expert, and we're going to do our best too. And we definitely need help in doing this. So, I mean, I'm grateful to you for the tip to check out the writing bar of Kay Tristan Tang, who's a Taiwanese military expert whose stuff you can read in English in the Jamestown Review, and he offers what strikes me as a learned and kind of fascinating rebuttal. Either of the just the standard, oh, it's just another case of a purge, or the sensational stuff that was reported in the Wall Street Journal about Zhang having been involved in leaking nuclear secrets to American intelligence. I think the people I've read dismiss this as an obvious Chinese info operation. It's the sort of thing you say when you really, really want to justify a major purge. To set the stage a little bit, it's worth saying the FT had some good numbers that since 2012, Xi has removed 80 senior PLA officers at the rank of lieutenant general or vice admiral and above. That's according to a US Naval War College tally. So in 13 years, 80, and 50 of those removals have happened since 2023. So it looks like an accelerating churn. I mean, I got to thinking, since 2012, that's 13 years, shall we say. I mean, how many senior generals would you expect to retire over a 13-year period? I mean, presumably the American military has a churn of roughly the same size over that period. Like generals are by definition old guys. If you had a normal retirement process, you'd expect at least that many, presumably, to age out. There's only so long you can stay as a general because it takes your entire life to get there. Obviously, the difference is the mode of doing this and the way in which it's been done and the politics that are associated with it. So I don't mean to trivialized, but I think it's also important to understand sort of organizational sociology. If you follow Tang's account, I mean, one of the things I learned from it was just the subtlety with which you need to read what sound like kind of boilerplate denunciations. So you say He Weidong, who was the most senior person most recently purged, was accused of abandoning his original mission, losing party discipline, suffering a collapse of belief, and a betrayal of loyalty, which sort of suggests a kind of he's a complete degenerate. And the current generation being purged are not being subject to those kind of allegations. So instead, what you see with them is, whereas the previous lot were accused of poisoning the PLA's political ecology, Zhang is being accused of severe damage to the military political awareness, and not just undermining, but trampling on the chairman responsibility system within the CMC. He Weidong was accused of severely damaging the image of the PLA. Zhang is accused of seriously undermining the image and authority of the PLA. So what all of this, Tang takes all of this to mean that there's actually a kind of substantive nub to all of this. I mean, one has got to assume that Chinese senior officials who've come up really continuously. Zhang, I think, joined the PLA in 1968 in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, has served all the ways up. Like, he has skeletons in his closet. That's not the question. The question is, does anyone choose to get them out and turn them into a charge against him? And what would motivate Xi to do that in relation to Zhang and the other senior figure that was purged? Tang insists that it's an issue of substance, and it's really all about the effort to prepare the PLA to meet the objective of being ready for a military confrontation over Taiwan in 2027. And it then goes to fundamental issues of troop training, the direction of the build-out. Everyone agrees that the PLA is going to be expanded, but you can do that, if you like, to maximize immediate impact in terms of breadth and scale, which apparently is more the Xi line. And the professional soldiers, Zhang, in fact, is one of the few senior Chinese soldiers to actually have had frontline combat experience in the war with Vietnam in the late 70s and mid 80s. The professional soldiers apparently were preferring a more focused, technically focused, more limited expansion of what they took to be actual fighting power, rather than, if you like, intimidatory front, which was the priority of Xi. And all of this has been coming to a head over a series of, and again, you need to get into the arcana of like Chinese CCP document formulation and drafting. But between 2025 and 2026, increasing gaps were opening up between Xi and his senior military. And since 2026 is the last year ahead of 27 in which you can do a training cycle. All of this is about how, we'll say more about it, how the bits of the Chinese military operate together. And we're just up for the announcement of a new 5-year plan, which will contain investment and spending priorities. This was the moment to move. So though there has been a rolling purge, part of this is a kind of generational reshuffle in the PLA. It's accompanied by a flurry of various types of denunciation. But if you get into the details of those denunciations, they seem to indicate something more of substance, of military doctrine and developmental priorities. And the timing doesn't seem accidental either, because there is this ticking clock towards 27.
That's really useful, this kind of close reading of these, it's tempting to think of as propagandistic denunciations.
But it is, but it's always nuanced, right? How do you spin it precisely? How do you position it? Is very interesting. What signal are you sending to everyone in the PLA and in the party?
It does get me wondering what the equivalent term for Kremlinology in the Chinese case is, if there is one. Peakingology. Okay,
yeah,
great.
There's a fantastic blog by that name, which I highly recommend to anyone who wants to get into the business of China policy watching. Peakingology. Yeah.
So yeah, I think you've usefully placed this move in the context of the broader kind of modernization campaign that Xi has overseen of the Chinese military. If we were to just take that campaign on its own terms, I mean, what has it amounted to? What has Xi actually been overseeing when it comes to reforming the Chinese military?
I mean, it's for real. I mean, And it's kind of interesting if you place it in the longue durée, right? Because, I mean, one of the strange features of Chinese imperial power, as ancient as it is that for long periods, militarism per se was not high status in Chinese political history, right? The high status were the scholars, the mandarins, the officials, not militarism. Militarism was a kind of barbaric thing. And part of the modernization of China from the early 20th century onwards has been a focus on the development of Chinese military power. And it's gone through a series of phases. Wanpo Military Academy was one of the kind of breeding grounds of modern Chinese nationalism in the early 20th century. And the CCP regime is, of course, built on the barrel of the gun, right? It is built out of victory in civil war against the Japanese, and then a full-on pitched battle civil war against the KMT through to 49. But that left China with that kind of army, an army that grew out of guerrilla campaigning, and then with massive Soviet aid was able to fight the pitched battles against the KMT after 45. And then became, as it were, the antagonists, of course, of the United States in the Korean War, which was fought at huge cost in terms of casualties by the Chinese because they were up against the vastly technologically superior enemy. And really, ever since, the PLA has been trying to figure out what it is in military terms. And certainly the PLA that came out of the 70s and 80s, which struggled to assert itself against the Vietnamese army, hardened, of course, by its long confrontation with the French and the Americans, was not a force that really knew where it was going in military terms. And you could say the same, of course, about the US military that kind of got its mojo back in Kuwait, and then in the second Iraq war, and then promptly lost it again in COIN in Afghanistan and Iraq. So modern militaries have a hard time defining who they are. And, after all, you and I talk about the Bundeswehr regularly, which is an army which really just stopped being a functioning military force. So it's hard to run modern militaries. But insofar as we have any kind of hard metrics of a military that looks serious, the PLA has been getting serious over the last generation. And that's a matter of spending. You cited the lowest level estimates. Off the books official elements take you into the 300s. The off the books unofficial plus purchasing power parity adjusted numbers would get you into the 400s. 400 billion, that is, dollars in terms of spending. So that would put China just squarely behind the United States amongst global military spenders. As a share of GDP, no one can get you much higher than 2% of GDP, so consistently less than the US. China is not emphasizing military spending as strongly as the US, but nevertheless, with an economy that as big as China's and growing as fast as China's, if you just spend 2% of a massively increasing pie, you end up with a huge military. And they have, since the early 2010s, been really doubling down on modernization. I mean, the Russians tried to do the same thing. The Americans have gone through iterations of modernization, the Europeans as well. But the Chinese are in this game. And as you would expect from the Chinese, they are delivering hardware results, right? They now have not quite perhaps cutting edge, but pretty close to cutting edge fighters. They are building out a nuclear force that will, in the next decades, produce a tripolar nuclear competition. So they're going to have a hard time with the submarine element because of the naval dimension, but they're working on it. So they're going to go for a kind of full nuclear trifecta of different types of military power. They are doing the right thing, which is cutting down the grunt infantry element in their force, because that's really a waste of money and manpower, and everyone in the modern age needs smaller, more lethal armies, not massive armies, unless you end up in a ghastly war like Ukraine, Russia, and no one in their right mind wants that, obviously. And they're building out the Navy rapidly enough now to mean that there aren't many war games of a Taiwan conflict which look good for the Americans at this point. I mean, you can do it, you end up with different scenarios, but none of them look terribly good. And going now into the depths where we really see also the emergence of this conflict, crucially, when you start thinking about modern militarism, the thing ever since the Second World War, but it has to be constantly reinvented, that you have to think about is the combination of military force, so air force, electronic warfare, ground warfare, rocket warfare, naval warfare. It's all about combined arms. And for the first time, really, in the history of the PLA in 2020, they issued an emphatic joint operations doctrine that basically said to everyone in the PLA, you've got to stop just doing artillery or infantry or naval operations. You have to think of yourselves as a combined joint force. That then entails a whole bunch of other things, like breaking the military units down from division and army and corps level down to brigade level, which is much more analogous to how Western militaries function. And everything suggests that the Chinese really are thinking through systematically at every level all of the elements of what it would take to make this a viable fighting force. I mean, it's you'd be crazy to ignore this. I don't think you have to be a military hawk on the American side to begin to take very seriously what they're doing. The ambition is clearly there to build and to turn the PLA into a 21st century fighting force rather than the kind of mid-century 40s, 50s powerhouse that it was. But that's clearly inappropriate to the 2020s. So, yeah, on every count, it amounts to something. Like, if you ask what does it amount to, it amounts to something pretty substantial by any metric that's available. Is it complete? Is it finished? Does it work? Those aren't questions you can easily answer. But do they show all of the signs of trying to build a highly competent 21st century military? Emphatically.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I also do wonder whether this modernization also accommodates the most recent kind of military developments that one sees in Russia and Ukraine with drone warfare. I mean, maybe it's hard or impossible to tell about the most, cutting edge doctrinal shifts, but clearly there's ambition here. But it does strike me in general that for all these changes, China also hasn't fought a major war, at least not in a very long time. And I'm curious how that itself should affect our assessment of its ability to even do so. I mean, in what ways does actual combat experience matter? How does it matter materially, and how does it matter strategically for a military like China's?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth underlining that point because that sometimes gets an eye roll when the Chinese say it. Like, by contrast with us, they haven't fought a major war against anyone in a very long time. It's just worth underlining that because, when we do the military technical conversation, we go, well, the Chinese don't know how to fight war. Yeah, blue sucks. You guys are naive. And then when the Chinese say we're not imperialists like you, everyone just rolls their eyes. Like, can't both be true. It's clearly true that China has not, unlike the United States, fought a regular war, major war, small war, anywhere, really, since the mid-1980s, right? Their special forces don't habitually fly into other places, extract, assassinate, and kill other people on a regular basis. It's a repressive regime at home, but it doesn't have that kind of external force projection. And yeah, one of the things that fascinates me about militarism per se and military history in general is it has this weird existential property, which is that everyone who's in the business agrees that you can't learn it except by doing it, right? You can think about it, you can prepare, anyone in their right mind would, everyone drills, trains, and so on. But there aren't any coherent accounts of military activity that don't fundamentally stress that you can't know it until you do it. Like and there's the only good way of really learning how to fight is to fight. And that's kind of, I mean, that's interesting at a philosophical level, that there are certain activities that have to be done practically, otherwise you aren't really knowing how to do them at all. And of course, it's terrifying from a geopolitical point of view, and it comes with inherent trade-offs. The first is simply that in truly high intensity combat, too many of your people get killed. And so one of the problems, and say the Soviets experienced this, Germans as well, in World War II, is that you have to churn through an entire army if you're in really highly, and the Ukrainians and the Russians are experiencing this right now, right? So you learn, and yet the people who've learned best actually die. The second thing is that you go down a path-dependent path of learning, right? Because no two conflicts are the same. And so the problem is that as you learn to optimize a particular type of conflict, you may be losing sight of the other sorts of things you should have been thinking about. So the American military had a huge crisis in the 2010s precisely over China, because they realized that for 15 years, for better or worse, they'd been trying to learn counterinsurgency operations. And all of a sudden, oh my God, we've got to do peer competition with the Chinese. We haven't been thinking about this. Presumably, the PLA is a super smart organization full of highly wired, Chinese technocrats who've been thinking very hard about all of these problems. They've certainly read their Clausewitz, like they know these problems of war. And what they will have been doing is just learning as much as they possibly can from Russia in the Ukraine-Russian war. And like when you speak about drones, where do we think the Russians get their drones from? I mean, we can't have it both ways. We insist that the Russians get all their drones from China. That's part of our shtick, against China. So if that's the case, there's someone in China who's learning an awful lot about drone warfare right now. And it would be one of the principles of PLA and Xi Jinping thinking is a civil military joined upness. So we would be crazy to assume that the Chinese and the PLA they don't just have a giant data tube going into their military brain going, okay, every single time a Chinese drone or some piece of Chinese kit is used by the Russians. I mean, the Ukrainians are using Chinese kit as well, right? The drone, it's not like anyone else makes drones at a large enough scale or pioneered the technology of doing so. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians have learned from the Chinese how to mass manufacture them. So one must assume the Chinese are in that. I think it would be nothing short of bonkers for anyone in the West and Europe and the US to imagine that we could go toe to toe with the Chinese in a drone conflict. If you look at drone displays around the world, if anyone's going to be able to orchestrate military drone swarms, it's I wouldn't want to bet against the Chinese from what I've seen of these, in these fake firework displays, which are actually drones. Like those are drone swarms.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to go back to your point about thinking of the use of the military as a practical art or a matter of practical knowledge, and because that would suggest that for a modernization drive, it would imply the need to use the military, right? I mean, not even as a strategic end, but as a means for the modernization itself, right? I mean, like,
or it would imply precisely the conflict we're seeing with Xi and we think is going on, and it's a classic conflict, which is the politician says, I want the biggest, scariest military I can have by date X because I've got a plan. Don't want to actually use it, but I want to scare somebody with the biggest military I can have. And the professional soldier says, but we don't know what will be the really scariest thing. And so what I'd rather do is limit my resource use right now, do a bunch of other things, prioritize experimental development, not go like full on for whatever the hottest thing is right now, because in 5 years' time, I don't know whether that will actually be the thing. And we won't, and none of us will know until we actually use this stuff. And this isn't to say they want to use it. It's just that if you are a professional soldier, deferring your technological decision until the latest possible date is the smart thing to do. Going early basically guarantees that you will be obsolete shortly inside the conflict when everyone actually discovers what was the important thing that no one could figure out ahead of time. Now, you can gamble that by placing all of your bets, all of your money on a certain set of chips, you can roll the enemy, overwhelm them, and that will win the game for you. This is a little bit like the stylized version of what people imagined the Germans did with Blitzkrieg, none of which is actually true. But when you thought about it, it seemed like that kind of strategy. With regard to technology, it's always losing bet to max out whatever is currently in front of you. And one of the ways of reading the conflict going on inside the military command chain is she just wants the biggest possible, scariest possible military as quickly as possible. Whereas the soldiers are saying, we're thinking 20, 30 years time horizon here. And so we might be better off slowly maturing these technologies so as to make the big bets at a later stage when we know what actually matters.
Yeah, that is interesting, this kind of inherent tension between a political or versus properly military perspective on some of these questions.
US Navy, for instance, not keen on aircraft carriers right now, or let alone Donald Trump's big battleships, right?
Yes,
like
right.
Most of the American Navy is thinking, sitting duck. Like, how could I miss it? The bigger he makes it, the more obvious, easy it is to hit. We can't really make them stealthy. And somebody will come along with some underwater drone that we don't even know yet that will just, take it down. So, and this is again a political thing, right? So Congress likes big ships, presidents like big ships. The Navy people actually don't know right now what the future of naval warfare is.
Yeah, and this tension, I think, also gives further texture to the allegations being made against these purged generals, and there's even talk of allegations that these generals were organizing a coup that have come up in certain reports about this news, and that got me thinking about coups in general, and how you know there are not that many examples from what I can tell of coups happening in communist states in the first place. I mean, there are examples of military forces using coups to establish communist regimes, but as far as communist states falling to coups, it was hard for me to think of one, except for the kind of farcical 1991 coup in the Soviet Union that sort of collapsed of its own accord. And I'm just curious what might explain that disjuncture. I mean, are communists just especially good at disciplining militaries for some reason?
Yeah, and there's a couple of cases apparently. The Ethiopian, Somalia, so like fragile developing country communist regimes have been taken down by coups, but you're right, not in the core. I mean, one way of answering this would be to say, should it be surprising? After all, it's also not the case that any communist regime has been taken down by a business uprising inside the country. The communist regimes transform social structure. Militaries are part of the social structure. They're not separate from the social structure. They too are social structures. So any thoroughgoing communist regime understands that transforming the class structure of the military is next to expropriating private property and redistributing land, like it's one of the big three that you do right at the very beginning. And in the case of China, as I was saying, because the modern, the emergence of the modern Chinese state, both on the nationalist and the communist side, went hand in hand with actually deciding that Chinese men needed to put on uniform and become militarists like Europeans. The project of building the communist state was always also about building the PLA, and the PLA, therefore, swears loyalty not to the Chinese nation or the Chinese state, but to the Communist Party. The PLA is the army of the Communist Party. And within that relationship, however, it is politics that commands the gun and not the other way around. So from the very beginning, this has been a political force, armed to the teeth, capable of fighting full-on war, but a political military. And core to the history of the regime, right? If you want to understand how China emerged from the most chaotic period in its history since the revolution, which is the Cultural Revolution, it's the PLA that gets sucked into the Cultural Revolution in the late 60s because Mao demands that they back the most radical factions, and then it's actually the PLA that does the stabilizing after 69. So half of the Central Committee, apparently by the early 70s, are soldiers. And then, of course, it's also the PLA which, when called upon in 89, turns its guns on the protesters in Beijing and then across China. So the PLA is like core to the regime. And part of Xi's project is clearly to think about what should an army commanded by the party look like when China transforms socioeconomically the way it has in the last 25 years. Like, what do you do? In the late 60s, early 70s, one place where you could have a secure job, regular food, a career track, housing was the military, right? Because China was poor and chaotic, and this was one line that you could go down. But from the 80s and 90s onwards, this is totally non-obvious. Why would the opportunity cost of becoming a Chinese soldier since the 90s has soared, right? Because these people are on civil servant salaries, they live in semi-derelict, public housing. This is dangerous. And one of the things, of course, that it does is to create the avenues for corruption, which are lethal to the authority of the regime, that also open China, the PLA, to Western penetration. The CIA will have a shopping list of people, how much you could buy. If you watch the infamous CIA recruiting video, which they put out in Chinese, it's all about class resentment. It's like, why would you put up with all of this hierarchical bullshit? You could be informing on China to the CIA, where you'll get freedom and wealth and whatever else. So the anti-corruption drive is, in both civil society and in the military, is part of it's the negative side of the CCP's effort to keep in touch with Chinese social change. But in the same way as building out the party to 130 million members with cells in every private housing estate, there's also a positive side to the expansion of the PLA. The vision of modernization is also an offer from the political leadership to the Chinese soldiers to say, you're not going to be left behind. You don't have to go on cosplaying revolutionary jungle warfare. You get to have high-tech stuff too. In fact, it's going to be glamorous and amazing. And you're going to be on television all the time, and Xi Jinping will be in uniform, and you get to be part of the China dream. So don't worry, and don't think you have to somehow, surrender your values so as to be able to drive a nice car. Like, we are going to take care of you and give you a meaningful place in Chinese society. And the sophistication of the CCP, of course, is it's just continuously thinking this problem in a much more overt way. If you read their stuff, they say it explicitly, than, say, in the US, where civil-military divides have de facto emerged. And we're seeing, the civil paramilitary divide in the ICE confrontations without any really coherent political discourse about it. The CCP fully understands the struggle necessary to, grow the economy to the spectacular extent, create mass affluence, create genuine huge wealth for the Chinese middle class, and somehow maintain an army that also has prestige and standing and reputation and is understood as a prestigious and desirable thing for, she says it, we must keep gaining the people, the army must win the people. So it's an attractive thing for it's essentially still very gendered. So it's something attractive for your son to do. Why, a son, in a Chinese family, a son, like if you're sacrificing your son to the PLA, you've got to have some pretty powerful motivations, because he could otherwise be going off being a doctor or an engineer or earning a lot of money in business. But so if he's going to go to the PLA, she needs to make that an attractive job. Otherwise, it's dead end and corrupt.
Yeah, fascinating that she has managed to synthesize all of this into a coherent worldview or ideology, and at the same time, the result of all these processes and these purges that we've been talking about is that she is, de facto the undisputed leader of the military at this point. And so, perhaps is a good way to end this conversation. I'm curious, what kind of military thinker at this point should we say she is? I mean, what does she think, or what has he said he thinks the military is even for?
I mean, it's reasonable, I think, to say that he's not, he's not first and foremost a thinker. He's not first and foremost a military guy, but he comes out of a generation whose entire history and family history was shaped by war, right? So Zhang and him, their dads were part of the heroic period of the PLA struggle. I think his dad was the commissar to Zhang's dad, who was a general. Like, these people, they are shaped by war to an even more profound extent than the equivalent generations in Europe would be, perhaps comparable with the Soviet Union, but without the break in 1989. So that's one element of this. But right from the very beginning, like, she, from 2012, 2013 onwards, is emphasizing the need to produce, and the phrase I think that's significant here is like a world-class military. Like, Xi's mission in the last 12, 13 years has clearly been to take China's growth and the development of Chinese society to the quote-unquote next level. So, after the reform and opening up in the 80s and 90s and the just hyper-rapid boom of the 2000s and the early 2010s, it's a message of modernization and stabilization. And the military are an indispensable part of this. And they're also, of course, not just sociologically, which I've been going on about so far, but they're also the tool of power of a large state. And it's quite clear in the early 2010s that in Xi's thinking, when he's thinking about new models of great power relations, China's graduated. China has graduated from being a revolutionary power and a developing economy to being a great power. And a great power has a great army. And it's just it's kind of just join up the dots. It would be dangerous and disequilibrated for a great power like China not to have a great army. It must have a great military. And then what sort of military should it be? Well, it should be modernized, and it needs to be under the control of the party. There's no other PLA. It's always under the control of. So how do you do that? And so things follow, if you like, from this chain of reasoning. The novelty is that he underlines that it must be able to fight, and when it fights, it needs to be able to win. And from 2020 onwards, November 2020, fall 2020, though apparently it was prefaced already in 2019, this is the moment when they're also turning the screws on Hong Kong. It's quite clear that a target is set for a military-backed confrontation with the United States over Taiwan. This doesn't mean they're planning to go to war, but it means that they set themselves the target of being capable of mounting an arm wrestling match over Taiwan in 27. And so I'd say it's those three elements. It's a kind of an element of an appropriateness. Modern China needs a modern military. A modern military must be capable of fighting. So, and that's different, right? You can have a big army, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's capable of fighting. So that means you really need to get into the weeds of making combined arms actually work. And so the military has to start training seriously around this stuff. And if you think about China, right, they could be training up against Russia, they could be training in the far west, or they could be training on the eastern seaboard. And where they've concentrated their training, they've increased their Marines to like 40 or 50,000 Chinese Marines now. One of the units within the Chinese army that's actually grown is the Marine component, the amphibious component. The specific target is to be in a different place from where you were 20 years ago if you're going to get into an arm wrestling match or the mid-90s confrontation over Taiwan. You want to be in a fundamentally different place if you were to choose to go for a confrontation. So I think those are the key elements. But what is striking in his thinking, and of course he has a team of people like writing all this stuff up, but it is holistic, right? It clearly does add up to a coherent vision of a modernized state power.
Yeah, that is a very useful breakdown. And it sounds like, on one hand, you're saying that the military has is embedded in a national mission and a kind of historical mission. But it also has a kind of military mission of its own.
I mean, you can't just sit around, right? Yeah. You've actually got to do, or at least be capable of threatening to do the business.
Well, we obviously will keep an eye on this in the years ahead. But for now, we should take a break, and we'll be back to talk about Milan. Hi, and welcome back. 1 week from when this episode is officially dropped, as the phrase goes, the Winter Olympics will be starting. It'll be hosted by Milan, or I guess more generally, it'll be hosted by the region of Lombardy, of which Milan is the biggest city. And so, we thought we'd do the classic ones and twos regional segment. We haven't done one of these in a while. So, we thought we'd sort of consider Lombardy and Milan from our economic perspective. And so, Adam, to start off with, Lombardy as a region, historically, it struck me that it's a fairly or Germanic region of Italy. And this sort of is contained in the name itself. The Lombards were Germanic tribes, right? And they displaced the Ostrogoths, other Germanic tribes. And then the region was later ruled, I guess, by Habsburg. So do we just tend to overlook the Germanic historical influence on Italy? Is that something that we should all sort of take more seriously when thinking about Italy?
We should absolutely understand it as an interconnected history, but whilst at the same time trying to undo our anachronistic late 19th, 20th century assumptions about what it means to be Italian and German, because the Roman Empire was overthrown famously by the Germanic tribes. But I mean, the Germanic tribes themselves aren't German, right? Yet, I mean, they're coming from the Carpathians. So, this is not Bismarck invading Italy. But yes, the Lombards owe their name, at least to the etymology I've seen, to the idea, to the Longobard or long beards, and one of the very many ways in which Italians can be handsome is they can be fair and red-haired, rather than the classic kind of Italian profile of dark hair. So there is, again, this is just sort of amateur ethnology and genealogy, but there is a powerful strain of East European culture that runs through. Politically, the Lombard dynasty was deeply connected to the Franks, also Germanic, though this is hotly contested in French history, and to the dynasty that settled in what is now modern Bavaria. More on that in a minute. And then all of northern Italy, what would later become northern Italy, was part of the Holy Roman Empire of German nations. In other words, broadly speaking, within a polity that was itself not strictly German, because it would contain bits of Eastern Europe and much of what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, but a kind of German-centered polity, which created huge amounts of intercourse, interchange between German intellectual life, particularly in the south of Germany, and Italy. The Germans got the Renaissance by visiting within this ecosystem, but also mounting resentment on the side of people on the Italian side at their subordination. Even as somebody as Machiavelli, for instance, is a thinker of frustrated Italian fragmentation, right? He looks back to the ancient period and sees this proud nation now subordinate to, believe it or not, what we now think of as Germany's humiliation, which is the Holy Roman Empire. And then as the Holy Roman Empire loses its shape, essentially what emerges is a northern Italy dominated by Austria. So Veneto and Lombardy, essentially part of the Habsburg Empire. And Italian unification consists of fighting this off with French help through wars in 1859 and 1866. With Piedmont, another one of the high-functioning, more French-aligned Italian mini-states, leading the charge against the Austrians. But not for nothing. I mean, if you spend any time, I was in Bavaria before Christmas, and Munich feels to me like a North Italian town, which feels a little bit like a civilized version of an Austrian town. Like there is a kind of transalpine culture of urban construction in the late 19th century, which creates a real affinity. Then, of course, there's the violent history of the 20th century with vicious war fought by the Italians from 1915 onwards against the Austrians and the Germans in the Alps and the Dolomites. And then, somewhat surprisingly, Mussolini's alignment with Germany, and then, of course, the retreat of Mussolini's regime to the Salo Republic in 1943, which means, again, that this whole band of northern Italy remains under ultra-fascist and Nazi control until the very end of World War II. This is where some of the most grim fighting is taking place in Europe in the swamplands of the Veneto. And then into the post-45 period, if you live in, what do we do when we get together at your place in Berlin? We eat pizza like everyone else in Germany. Like the Americans think of themselves as having a deep affinity to Italy through the Italian-American connection. It's true in Germany as well. From 45 onwards, Italian guest workers are one of the earliest and largest and most culturally influential components of the migration. And as in Britain, Italian guest workers are welcomed in the way that, say, Turkish or Yugoslav guest workers are not. And so a cafe culture, a restaurant culture emerges, which deeply shapes both sides. I mean, there are wings of, say, the Green Party in Germany, which are literally known as the Tuscany faction, because that's where they all go on holiday. And that's where German party politics migrates, at least for a while. It migrated to northern Italy over the summer, which is where the Germans would do their infighting. So insofar as there is an integrated Europe, as a cultural and social level in the 20th and 21st centuries, the flux between South Germany in particular, not so much Hamburg and the Ruhr, but the flux between South Germany, Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, across the Alps to northern Italy, is one of the real cultural connections that emerges for a period at least. I think it's been somewhat attenuated recently, but in the late 20th century, early 21st century, this was a real thing. Think in terms of the American side of like the New South. The sense that bits of the south of the United States, southern states, which frankly didn't matter very much to the Northeast for a while, suddenly become relevant. There's kind of a new south for Germany, and it's northern Italy.
Interesting. Yeah. These material connections are visible in the ways you're talking about, and at the same time, I'd also say there's a kind of, from the German perspective, and I'm curious, I guess, from the Italian as well. There is a kind of connection precisely in imagining Italy as the other, right? I mean, and that's a connection of its own, and that's also historical. Going, obviously Goethe, the canonical German writer, traveled to Italy and wrote about it. And so there is a kind of cultural connection precisely in thinking of it in as different. But yeah, and
but it's a sort of difference internal to the family, like
precisely
the difference between that, for instance, and Africa, also not far away, is radical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, precisely. It is that's a very good way to put it. But I guess to now focus even more on Lombardy today, it's well known as one of Europe's most highly productive economic regions, and sometimes that's contrasted with the rest of Italy, frankly. And I'm curious why Lombardy is as productive as it is, and why that doesn't carry over to kind of more struggling parts of Italy. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic, something we should maybe come back to in a separate segment. But yeah, Italy, like many countries, the US as well, of course, traditionally had huge regional divides in economic model, which then had consequences as societies developed over time. And Italian city-states, the famous Italian city-states of the north, were amongst the richest places in Europe by the early modern period, and by default, the richest places in the world. These were some of the most sophisticated urban settlements, some of the only places in Europe that could remotely match Asian craftsmanship were in Italy and southern Germany, in part of this kind of connection. So they've long been real centers of craft production. And as recently as the 1980s, the Tuscan northern Italian model of what was called flexible specialization was widely regarded around the world as, along with the Japanese model, the great alternative to crude mass production of the Detroit Fordist variety. Now, Fiat, Italy also had mass production of a classic type, which would be Fiat in Turin. For a long time, Fiat, little known in the US as a car maker, but for a long time, one of the really big boys in the global car market, widely imitated across the world. Eastern Europe drove essentially Fiat-derived cars. Italy had that as well, but the really distinctive thing about northern Italy was this flexible specialization, community-based, highly flexible networks of production, an image which still continues now in, say, Silicon Valley as a story, where you have, lots and lots of hubs of innovation sitting side by side. You have a venture capital, which in the Italian case would have been various types of credit cooperative. This image of small-scale regional units of highly craft production is one that was actually understood and theorized for the first time in northern Italy. And it was always contrasted within Italy itself to the South, because the South was agrarian, again, shades of the US. It was big latifundia estates. There were various types of unfree labor, sharecropping in Italy. There were struggles over land and land distribution down to the 40s and early 1950s, violent struggles. There was, of course, the mafia that emerged in the absence of powerful state formations. And so within Italy itself, the typical opprobrious remark of the North was Africa starts at Rome, and they included Rome in Africa. Rome was unfortunately made into the capital of a unified Italy by an overambitious group of politicians in the north. But everyone understood that culturally it was Venice, Florence, Padua, places like this that were really the heart of Italy, and the commerce was really in Turin and in Milan. They had a hard time dealing with the reality of places like Naples, which have huge ancient universities, deep culture. So the North would, of course, sort of shilly-shally around this. But that problem of the divide between the North and the South goes profoundly deep. And the origins of hard right Italian politics that we've had cause to talk about often on the show were really, it was the Northern League, right, which came out of the 70s and 80s as a resentful party of anti-welfare, business-orientated, right-wing politics representing the interests of the North against exploitation by welfare scroungers from the South, right? And that's one of the cores of right-wing politics. Another more open, gregarious would be Berlusconi, who's a Milan boy through and through, right? Coming out of that kind of zone of Italian business and show business.
Hmm. Yeah, so I guess maybe to take a closer look at Milan specifically as an economic hub, there are all sorts of diversified businesses in the city that seem to kind of play a big role in its economic success. But internationally, I think it's fair to say it's known uh, as being a fashion capital. If one were to kind of think of the major fashion capitals of Europe, or maybe even of the world, Milan would maybe come up perhaps right after Paris. Um, and if we were to sort of take these two cities and consider them as competing fashion capitals, I mean, how do they compare to one another exactly as champions of the global fashion industry exactly?
Yeah, especially for menswear, Milan, the Pitti Uomo is the kind of the dandy moment of the of the fashion season, and that's maybe also indicative. Like, whereas I mean, you and me talking about fashion is going to be one of the comedy moments of ones and twos this year. Uh, but with the help of AI and some casual observation, apparently the view is that the Parisian style is simultaneously kind of restrained, more muted palettes, and more experimental. Whereas the style of Milan is more flamboyant, a louder prints. It's after all, the north of Italy is one of the great textiles hubs of the world. People will hear Italian flannel, Italian wool. This is what feeds into this fashion regime. It's also, I think, true that the Milan fairs are more focused on ready to wear rather than truly haute couture. Though I may be doing people a disfavor here. And all of this takes on. Apparently, I was not aware of this, but whilst we were focused on other things, a huge upheaval has happened in the leadership of all of the major fashion houses over the last year. And so, the question of the spring season is being awaited with a bated breath, because there's been changes at Balenciaga, at Gucci. We have people coming in from Fendi and Valentino. There's a new director at Versace, at Bottega Veneta. And then in Paris as well, we have new design leadership at Chanel and Dior. And so we're really talking about a huge multinational churn in the leadership of the leading fashion brands in both France and Italy. And so there's a new excitement about the Milan versus Paris race. One should add, perhaps, that this also goes back to the story about why northern Italy has always been this great hub of economic prosperity. It's a fantastically worldly place, right? It's extraordinarily densely connected. The Silk Road ends, at the European end in Venice, right? The connections to Africa, which are derided by the xenophobic advocates of northern nationalism, also, of course, mean that Italy is connected to the Middle East in the way that, say, a France is, but a Germany emphatically is not. And so you see that also in the cosmopolitan nature of the fashion business. Like, this brings together influences from all over. I was really struck the last time I spent time going in the countryside in northern Italy of the pockets of Chinese labor and expertise, quite a lot of it without proper documentation, that have settled in northern Italy, because of course they see a close affinity between the kind of small scale textiles production that they're familiar with from the first phase of Chinese growth, and Italy, glass making as well, one of the kind of classic trades of northern Italian craftsmanship. Again, an area where the Chinese compete very, very vigorously, using a model of production, these regional networks of densely embedded craft expertise, which is very similar to the Italian one. And if the Italian economy has been under a shadow in the last generation, it has a lot to do with domestic problems and structural issues. It has to do with the Eurozone and the mismanagement of the Eurozone, a gamble. We've done this on the show, like the Italian gamble on the Eurozone. It also has to do with the China shock. And so, asserting fashion leadership, cultural leadership, is one of the kind of high-end places that Europe can go. These are brands which still have, all of these brands, both French and Italian, still have huge markets in China and real cachet, which gives them an edge which other Western products are progressively losing in China.
Good to know. I mean, I feel like we would fit in either of those cities.
Oh, for sure.
I don't want to. I feel like, or maybe we'd benefit from a little more exposure.
I like, that's a good way of putting it. We should spruce ones and twos up by spending some time in either Milan or Paris. This is a great idea. We're far too comfortable in our grungy Berlin.
Berlin accommodates a broader spectrum of fashion choices, but the other industry that Milan is known for, certainly in Italian terms, is it's Italy's finance hub. And I'm curious whether there is anything distinct about Milan's approach to finance. Where does it stand in relation to other financial capitals in Europe?
So, I mean, apparently it has a great tax regime. That was one thing I learned, a kind of flat tax for foreign income, and that's apparently attracting quite a lot of high-end money. It's obviously a glamorous and fabulous city to live in. So it has everything you would be looking for in a financial sector. I found a rather interesting ranking of financial capitals, which put Milan in a kind of quadrant which is fully internationally capable, but yet not a global center. So at the level of a Amsterdam or a Hamburg or a Boston or a Chicago, let me correct that. Apparently Amsterdam, the Dutch, actually fully feature in the global range. But we're talking a second-tier player with established international reputation. Italy has a series of significant banks. UniCredit is probably the one that plays in the really top leagues in Europe. And it's always and long had an infrastructure of small banks, which can be a real virtue from the point of view of industrial development, because they provide local on-the-ground credit to manufacturers who otherwise might find it difficult to gain credit. But on the other hand, also when your economy goes into structural slowdown, become a real burden on national development, because they accumulate bad debts, and then you have to engage in really complicated political bargains to manage those, and you have to persuade other people in Europe, notably the Germans, to accept some of the risk that would be involved in forming a banking union. UniCredit is such a powerful player that they've actually attempted to take over German banks and been refused by the Germans because they're worried about the powerhouse of Italian finance. So I think, in Europe, Italy would be a Boston or a San Francisco or it's not Wall Street, it's not in the City of London league, it's not in the league even of Paris or Frankfurt, but it's certainly a place that Italy's own globalized business can do business from.
Yeah, and I guess maybe that is part of the point, that for all the talk, there is still not a sort of proper capital union in Europe, and Milan can serve as a national hub, but without being a kind of international player. Um, yeah, I mean, maybe to end this conversation, I wonder whether we can sort of come back to where we started in the sense of Italy's identity as an economic actor. And we tend to think of Italy as a Mediterranean country, and now it's hosting this Winter Olympics in its northern Alpine region. And I'm curious whether Italy is also maybe more properly an Alpine country, given how its economy is structured. And do the mountains affect Italy's national economy and its culture and its history as much as countries like Austria and Switzerland and France say?
Yeah, so it really is. If you look at the geography of Italy, it's obviously the boot that extends into the Mediterranean, but Italy has 27% of the Alpine range compared to 20% which are in France. So it's not in the same league as Switzerland or Austria, but it's absolutely a key. It's one of the four big Alpine countries. Altogether, if you look down the Apennines, the entire peninsula is mountainous. So depending on the estimates, you can put anywhere up to 40 to 50% of Italy's geography as mountainous, so over 600 meters. And much of the rest is hilly. So the amount of Italy that's flat is really not a lot, because it's just the coastal strip and the Venetian plain, compared to, say, France, which also has, it has the Pyrenees and the Alps, and then it has the Massif Central, which are elevated, but very large areas of flat country as well. Ditto for Germany, the Rhine Valley. So Italy is a hilly, mountainous place. Its history, its military history, is entirely shaped by this. World War One in Italy was a mountain war. The fact that you can have a partisan resistance movement in Italy at the strength that you do is because of the fact that it's really difficult to chase them into the Apennines. You can establish, full-on military bases within reach of the big cities, because you're up in the hills and hard to reach. The way this has shaped the economy is perhaps less evident now than it would have been 100 years or so ago. Is that it's slow to build railways because the geography is not terribly suitable. But the more positive thing is that the early origins of electrification are in hydropower. And in combination with German capital, the north of Italy is one of the first great zones of industrial electrification. And, this is long forgotten now, but Italy in the mid-20th century and through to the 80s and 90s was seen as one of Europe's great electronics champions. I mean, I remember as a kid reading about the great breakthroughs in Italian microcomputing led by firms like Olivetti that were key players in the early electronics revolution. And like in France, which also had its own version of, Minitel, its own version of the early internet, Italy through to the 90s and 2000s was widely seen as a alternative hub, a kind of, it's not Silicon Valley, but Italy, on the other hand, also had Ferrari and Alfa Romeo and Lamborghini and, extraordinary design talent in mechanical engineering. And so that combination put Italy in a very strong position. And early on, the electrical side of that, not the Fiat, agip, the hydrocarbon side, but because they don't have no coal. So Italy leapfrogs coal into petrol and gas. But on the other side, it's also a major hydropower powerhouse. And so that's a profound way in which the mountain geography has shaped the country's, at least its sort of mid-phase 20th century industrial history.
Fascinating. And, I guess I would just add that whether this becomes a sort of self-conscious aspect of its national identity is a matter of, malleable political choices as well. And, there was something in my visits to Austria, and there's a national museum there. The fact that Austria is this kind of self-consciously Alpine country was a choice sort of after World War II to emphasize that. Maybe something like that could happen in Italy after, say, a Winter Olympics. But we will see and be watching the Olympics. At least I will. I always love the Olympics. And otherwise, we'll be back with you all next week.